For those of you who don't know, Charlie Kirk is a right-wing propagandist, the founder of Turning Point USA. In a recent video, he claims to smash a college Marxist. Now don't expect the thumbnail to have anything to do with the video. Turning Point propaganda would be incomplete if it didn't prioritize stereotyping its opponents over addressing their arguments.
If the Soviet example was so great, why were people fleeing the Soviet Union for Western democracies and they weren't fleeing Western democracies for the Soviet Union?
Now it's worth pointing out that some people did migrate to the Soviet Union. However, what stopped many people was a commitment to revolution in their own countries. That is the nature of class-conscious Marxists. For more context, you can watch the trial of Paul Robeson, a black American musician, famous for his performance of the Soviet national anthem. I've left the link in the description. Also in the description is a poll taken by Russia Today that shows that a great number of people who lived in the Soviet Union have a favorable view of it. It's also necessary to take into account the economic context of the Russian Revolution. Tsarist Russia was a very poor and underdeveloped country. The USSR suffered from scarcities in its early years as a result from that underdevelopment. Because of this, there was very little reason for people to migrate to the USSR in its early years, even if they did agree with it, and despite its upward economic trajectory.
Yeah, I don't defend the generation of the Soviet Union. As I was pointing forward, the Lenin and Trotsky, they pointed out that the revolution was international, that it was contained within a single nation.
So what's coming next is typical of Charlie Kirk. Not an argument against socialism or in favor of capitalism, but a list of countries he doesn't like.
It wasn't contained. You tried it in Afghanistan, you tried it in Ukraine, you tried it in Lithuania, you tried it in Latvia, you tried it in Zimbabwe, you tried it in Cuba, you tried it in Central America, you tried it all throughout the... What are you talking about? You tried it on the Korean Peninsula, you tried it in Kyrgyzstan, you tried it in Pakistan, you tried it in China, you tried it in Vietnam, you tried it in Laos, you tried it in Cambodia, you tried it in Indochina. What do you mean contained?
Now, of course, Kirk does not show his opponent's response, so we have no way of knowing who actually won the debate. I would not be surprised if the so-called college Marxist had a hard time responding to this rambling list of countries. Kirk repeatedly interrupted him and provided him with a great deal of claims to respond to. However, I am going to respond. Since Kirk can't interrupt me on my own goddamn channel, I can take the time to sufficiently examine this cumbersome list. I will be answering the following questions about each country. Was it socialist? And if it was, can it truly be considered an export of the Soviet model, as Kirk claims? Did the country succeed, fail, or fall somewhere in between? And if it experienced difficulties or even failures, why? Was it because of the economic system? Was it because of other internal conflicts? Or was it because of external forces? First of all, Afghanistan. This country was only under socialist control for a very brief period, beginning with the revolution in 1978. Immediately after, a jihadist counter-revolution took place, led by a group known as the Mujahideen. The American government was quick to support this insurrection. They hoped it would provoke a Soviet invasion, which would be a drain on resources in the Soviet Union. This prediction came true, and did have some of the desired economic effects. However, the support of the Mujahideen would later have a serious unintended consequence. The insurgent group would later fragment. Among this jihadist group was Osama bin Laden. His fragment, known as Al-Qaeda, would later be responsible for America's worst terror attack. An American war in Afghanistan would later ensue. Currently, American troops are being killed with weapons provided to the Mujahideen by the American government. In sum, Soviet involvement in Afghanistan was arguably an error in foreign policy. However, one cannot prove that the jihadist counter-revolution would have succeeded on its own, considering its internal contradictions. considering the impact of American involvement in Afghanistan, both on the American and Afghan people. The course of events is a stronger indictment of the United States of America than it is of the Soviet Union. Kirk then goes on to name several countries that were part of the Soviet Union. I am going to address those as a whole. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Russia and the other modern-day countries that were part of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union was extremely underdeveloped before the revolution took place. It was also a despotic monarchy, which had only recently done away with serfdom. Workers were expected to labor for over 12 hours per day. Food shortages were common and especially bad during the First World War. Over 80% of people were peasants. The military was poorly equipped and struggled greatly in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Bolshevik Revolution removed the country from World War I and crushed any chance of a restoration of the Tsar. A food shortage persisted in the early years, largely due to a civil war. However, caloric consumption of the average citizen gradually increased. A 1983 CIA report, now this is the CIA, arguably the most rabidly anti-communist organization on Earth. The report admits that the average Soviet citizen was consuming nearly as much as the average American, and that the Soviet diet was more nutritious. Both countries had people consuming more food than what was necessary. The Soviet Constitution declared a right to rest and leisure. According to an International Labor Organization report, the Soviet workday hovered between 7 and 8 hours, and the work week between 5 and 6 days. This is a significant improvement over the 12, 13, 14-hour days worked in Tsarist Russia. Workers were given annual paid vacations. Despite this ease of the burden on the workers, rapid industrialization took place, causing the Soviet Union to catch up with the West. Strengthening of the military enabled a World War II victory, ending the Holocaust and forever freeing the human race from the grim specter of Nazism. Technological advancement was so great that the former backward feudal country was the first to put an object in space, followed by an animal, Laika, and then a human, Yuri Gagarin. The African nation of Zimbabwe was formerly known as Rhodesia. Rhodesia was an apartheid state, a settler colony, much like South Africa. The country was governed by a white settler minority, which was only 5% of the population, and named after the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes. Notable sympathizers of this apartheid state include MLK assassin James Earl Ray and the mass murderer Dylann Roof. Guided by Marxism-Leninism and aided by already existing socialist countries, militias led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe brought an end to the apartheid state and built a relatively democratic society. That said, Zimbabwe has dealt with a great deal of strife and violence since the revolution. This has been the case in many African countries, as boundaries drawn by imperialists have displaced ethnic groups, leading to conflict over both culture and economics. Internal contradictions in the country are strong, and the Mugabe government has not succeeded in solving them democratically. Economic results have been mixed. The multi-dimensional poverty index has decreased. However, the country is still plagued by high prices and food insecurity. While an improvement on its predecessor, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe is not one of the better examples of Marxism-Leninism as a political and economic system. Now for a better example, China. Before the Chinese Communist Revolution, rural parts of the country were under control of landlords and warlords. These were not landlords of the capitalist sense. They did not simply own apartment buildings. These were feudal lords. Chinese port cities were under control not of China, but of European imperial powers. In remote regions such as the Cool Mountains, slavery was common. Some remote societies practiced headhunting. Chinese women had the legal status of property and were almost never given education. Youngest daughters of poor families were often sold as domestic servants. During the Second World War, the country was ravaged by the rising Japanese Empire. Mao's government removed the lords from power. It defeated and expelled both the European and Japanese imperialists, making China fully autonomous. Backward practices of slavery and headhunting were abolished, and women were given de jure equality and guaranteed education. The life expectancy increased by over 30 years and is now 5 years greater than the world average. China's problems were of great scope, and addressing them was a Herculean task. However, Mao handled them far better than the right-wing Kuomintang could have, and the country has made unprecedented and unequaled strides forward. Before Castro's revolution, Cuba was governed by Fulgencio Batista, who came to power through an American-backed military coup. Batista favored the interests of American businesses over those of the Cuban workers and had a strong relationship with the mafia. According to former President John F. Kennedy, United States companies owned about 40% of the Cuban sugar lands, almost all the cattle ranches, 90% of the mines and mineral concessions, 80% of the utilities, practically all the oil industries, and supplied 2/3 of Cuba's imports. That is a direct quote. Batista was a brutal dictator, and his henchmen used inhumane methods of punishment, such as blinding and genital mutilation. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led a revolution which brought an end to the Batista regime and executed the perpetrators of the aforementioned crimes against humanity. In addition, they launched campaigns intended to improve the lives of the Cuban people. A country once plagued by a lack of education now has a literacy rate of 99.8%, one of the highest in the world. Improvements in healthcare have led to an astonishingly high life expectancy and a low infant mortality rate, especially considering the economic situation in the 1950s and the sanctions imposed by the American government. The country has virtually eradicated homelessness, and infrastructure has been on a general upward trajectory. Now, it's unclear what Kirk is talking about when he says Central America, since he is naming a region rather than a country, much like Indochina. I think he's talking about Guatemalan President Arbenz. Now, Arbenz was not a socialist, definitely not a Marxist-Leninist. However, he did nationalize much of the nation's farmland, which had previously been owned by the American United Fruit Company. Because of this, the CIA catalyzed a military coup that removed the democratically elected leader from power. For the most part, Kirk's list serves not as an indictment of socialism as an economic system, but rather of American foreign policy. This inadvertently reveals the violent and interventionist nature of capitalist nations. For example, take another country on the list. Venezuela. This country is currently under threat of a terrorist opposition. The United States of America and other first world countries sympathize with these terrorists and are attempting to damage the Chavez and Maduro government, which has popular support through sanctions. The revolution led by Chavez had similar goals as that led by Castro, to free the country from imperialism and improve the lives of the workers. Unlike Cuba, it is not Marxist-Leninist, and therefore not an export of the Soviet model, as Kirk claims, and has been only a partial success. However, it is similar in that it was a left-wing anti-imperialist revolution which the American government has tried to destroy by any means necessary. An even more egregious example of American foreign policy can be found in Kirk's list: Cambodia, part of Indochina, a term which hardly anyone uses anymore because it's highly misleading, because no one in the region would identify as Indo-Chinese. Nixon's illegal bombing of this neutral country during the Vietnam War, another attack on a socialist, anti-imperialist country, killed numerous civilians and enabled the rise of Pol Pot, perhaps the most brutal dictator the region has ever known, who was then unseated by the socialist Vietnamese military. With the possible exception of Zimbabwe, Kirk's list is a composite of examples of general economic success under socialism and examples of potential success being thwarted by violent imperialists. Now, Kirk's opponent was likely trying to make an argument very different from mine, considering he seems to be a Trotskyist. When he said the Bolshevik Revolution was contained within a single country, he likely meant that the German Revolution was impeded by the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg, and that Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution never took place. It would be great if we actually got to hear his argument, but that's apparently too much to ask for. The debate of permanent revolution versus socialism in one country, the former advocated by Trotsky and the latter by Stalin, is one that I will address in future videos that focus on the Soviet Union, but I really don't have time to get into it here. This video, of course, was a brief overview of the countries Kirk listed. The situation in each country is very complex, and both internal and external problems exist. Addressing those problems should be of great interest to the modern Marxist movement. The way these countries are approached by the capitalist media, however, is slanderous. Kirk is regurgitating generalizations and misrepresentations that he has apparently taken in from sources with clear imperialist agendas, and his unwieldy list of countries he doesn't like reflects a refusal to perform nuanced historical and economic analysis.